The interesting thing for us about looking at sort of contemporary forms of witchcraft is that it absolutely is about women, a lot of young women especially, finding their power.
Welcome to the Research for Good podcast. My name is Professor David Ellis, and today I'm joined by Dr Lorna Stevens, who's an Associate Professor of Marketing. She's recently published the book Bewitching Consumer Culture, Witchcraft, Feminism and Markets. Lorna, welcome. I'm always struck when we do these podcasts, the diversity of research that's going on in the School of Management. And so you've just published a book about witchcraft. And of course, people hearing that might think, management school?
I am in a management school. And I'm looking at markets, obviously, hence the markets part of the title. I'm looking at markets. I'm looking at consumer behaviour. I'm looking more broadly at the things we consume. And in this case, the function is the consumption of witchcraft, but also how it evolved over time. So looking at media representations of witches, how it intersects with feminism, of course, a feminist scholar. So it's really looking at that sort of the interesting nexus, to use that sort of cool word, between witchcraft, feminism and markets and how it all intersects.
And so how did this book come about? Because you've previously published work around witchcraft and witches. So is this the culmination of lots of that work, or was this book always bubbling away? Or
we were stirring a cauldron in the background, David, you might say. Yeah, there were a few little strands coming together nicely because Pauline, my co-author, had done research in Glastonbury several years back, and we got interested in glamour as a form of witchcraft, but specifically in the context of retailing. So there were a few strands coming together. But also, Pauline and I started at the University of Ulster at the same time, and we immediately thought, wouldn't it be interesting to bring a bit of feminism into marketing? Let's do that. And then one of the male professors, who shall remain nameless, dubbed us the Three Witches. And he also spoke to the Dean about our shenanigans.
So we actually had a problem. He wasn't just being flippant, he actually had
a problem. Issue. And he went to the Dean and he said, we're going to have to put a lid on this feminist shit. And that plus the Three Witches appellation.
And that was because it worried him in some way.
It worried him.
Frightened him.
It frightened him. He thought that they're going to be trouble, those three. And in fact, one of the early pieces we wrote was stirring the marketing cauldron. We kind of went with it, so it's always been percolating. Mm-hmm. Also, I grew up in Northern Ireland, near to a place called Island which is a small peninsula. And Island was the site of the last witch trial in Ireland, as far as I know. So I kind of grew up in an area where there's a lot of folklore around the idea of witchcraft. So I think that had a bearing as well.
Yeah.
Lots of little strands sort of coming together.
Yeah. So there's the academic side, and then there's also sort of your own experiences, both as an academic, but also perhaps even way before you were an academic.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, and a sort of a fascination with the figure of the witch, as a figure who is, shunned, marginalised, persecuted. If a woman was perceived to be a witch, whether there was any evidence or not, and as we know with the sort of witch craze that gripped people, for several hundred years, a lot of these women were not practicing witchcraft. They were just women who, for one reason or another, stood out in some way and caught the attention of these witch finders.
And so, in terms of how people listening might be sort of more familiar with some of that history around, witches, how, for a sort of layperson, how does that link to markets or marketing?
Well, our first chapter is a sort of history of, and how did the witch become this sort of maligned, evil figure in popular culture. And to understand that, we have to go back to when, through the invention of printing, for example, suddenly ideas were able to be more widely sort of disseminated, and images appeared of what these alleged witches looked like. So there was a certain physiognomy associated with witches. There was a famous book written by a couple of Dominican priests called the Malleus Maleficarum. It was like a manual, how to spot a witch and how to punish a witch and how to get a confession out of a woman suspected of being a witch. I mean, it was a big tome and it was a bestseller. It was sort of up there with the Bible in terms of sales, widely distributed. So that's where markets come in, if you like. This book was just a blockbuster, you might say.
And so today we see that in other ways in terms of how feminism or how men and women are represented in a variety of different ways.
No, exactly.
That is obviously not quite they're a witch, but...
Well, I mean, you get men using that same term, saying that they're the victim of a witch hunt, for example. You get women compared to witches, so we can think of lots of examples. Female politicians especially often get accused of being witches. We talk more about that at the end of our book, actually, about women in power and how that is often sort of conflated with that label of being a witch.
Does it always need to be that, the label, or it's just kind of... It makes me think about, highly publicised examples of certain men who no longer work for the BBC who said, they were accused of something by women of a certain age. They don't say witch hunt, but they get very, very close to saying that.
Yes, they do. I mean, we've got a chapter actually talking about women of a certain age. We do have a chapter on the crone, the third aspect of the triple goddess, and of course the word crone we associate with the archetypal witch, don't we? The evil old hag that Shakespeare wrote about in Macbeth. These representations of the witch had a ready market. They were hugely popular. They were disseminated widely, and they shaped popular perceptions of witches and led to the persecution of thousands of women across various countries.
So you've written this book, and it resonates, with modern day as well as that kind of history. I guess my question is, by studying this, by writing about this, what would you like to see change?
Well, one of the things that the book is trying to do is reclaim the word witch. I mean, that's been happening for some considerable time. The American feminist Mary Daly famously defined the word witch as a woman's power. And the whole sort of reclaiming movement, it was all about trying to kind of get away from this perception of the witch as this evil figure. She was a powerful figure, and what needed to happen over time was to sort of have a better understanding of where it all came from, in terms of mythology, in terms of history, but also to not ignore the other side of witchcraft. So, for example, if you go back to, the Malleus Maleficarum, the women that we were most suspicious of were concubines, midwives, head witches, any woman who seemed to have some sort of power in some sort of domain. They were particularly, suspect. The only women that they weren't suspicious of were nuns. Right. Every other woman was potentially a witch.
And it sounds like the more, coming back to the kind of example of women in power now, the more power they held, or the further up they moved, the more they were becoming a target.
No, exactly. And I mean, Silvia Federici has written a lot about land grabs. And in fact, going further back, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, an American suffragette, first wave feminist, wrote about land grab. The church, very often, these women being accused of witchcraft were widows with land, of property. And of course, if they were accused of being witches, the church took possession, confiscated their property, their land, whatever. But what happened then towards the end of the 19th century, heading into the 20th century, was this emphasis on this, if you like, white witchcraft, to differentiate it from, black witchcraft, Eve, the evil witch figure, and indeed the emergence of Wicca, in the 1930s, which was actually about benign witchcraft. It was a spiritual system upholding sort of the feminine as distinct from the masculine principle. And it became hugely popular and is to to this day, Wicca is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, earth-based religions. It is a religion. And so that is the other side of witchcraft, and also the healing side of witchcraft, which is where what we talk about in our Green Witchcraft chapter. It all goes right back to these women who, these herbalists, these midwives, these women working with what they had, what they could grow, understanding the properties of plants and what have you, to help people, to heal people, is really where Green Witchcraft is coming from. And that has grown very, pretty much entirely due to the internet.
Can you tell us a bit about sort of more contemporary or technologically driven types of witchcraft?
Yeah. When I talk about Green Witchcraft and the spate of books that came out from about 2020 on, I've also got to talk about the impact of social media. And that's the main way that these young witches are communicating with one another. So the witches of Instagram, Witch Talk, huge numbers of followers on particularly Instagram, TikTok, Facebook to an extent, Reddit. There's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of sharing. A lot of it's very visual, of course. So, the TikTok medium, the Instagram medium is about, if you like, aesthetics. So many of these green witches, white witches, glamour witches, putting together this very, very nice, aesthetically appealing content. And very often they're also selling things. Or there's some of the bigger influencers, for example, attract the attention of certain brands. So there are a lot of really powerful witch influencers out there. And that's a really important way in which contemporary witches can express themselves and, if you like, advertise their wares and, just to develop a community and feel part of a community. These are very vibrant communities, both online but also offline, increasingly offline as well.
You mentioned online communities and offline communities, and Glastonbury is obviously an example of that.
Yeah. No, Glastonbury, well, as you know, is a sort of sacred landscape. It is a sort of the centre of spiritual pilgrimage in the UK, I would say, and it attracts people of all shades in terms of religious belief systems. But it is the centre of Wicca in the UK, and we all know about the Glastonbury Tour, the Chalice Well. The actual high street of Glastonbury is filled with sort of New Age, witchcraft, magic, earth-based religion, bookshops, gift shops, meditation centres. There's a goddess centre for people who come to worship the divine goddess. I mean, it's just such a sort of a welcoming place that all religions will be accepted there. But I think particularly New Age religions, earth-based religions, if you like Wicca, it is sort of the mecca for Wicca in the UK, because it is just this incredibly layered, spiritual landscape and spiritual marketplace, which we write about in our Glastonbury chapter, the spiritual marketplace of Glastonbury. How the marketplace fits with sort of spiritual practices is very much what our chapter in Glastonbury is about.
So, just coming back to the book itself, so this is certainly not the first thing you've written about witchcraft.
I mean, witches probably came into our marketing and feminism book because it just fits so nicely. Like whenever we started sort of talking about feminism, we were, as I illustrated, considered to be witches, because feminism was considered to be, what are you women complaining about? You've got equality, just shut up and get on with it. And then, of course, feminism came back into fashion again. I mean, there have been the waves, as we know. And the interesting thing for us about looking at sort of contemporary forms of witchcraft is that it absolutely is about women, a lot of young women especially, finding their power. So the language that is used in green witchcraft, in glamour magic, in popular TV and films as well, it's finding power, it's setting intentions. The language they use is like manifesting, affirmations, spell work, feeling that you can sort of control things a little bit. If you tune in, if you align your various sort of magical practices with the phases of the moon, for example,
Yeah.
the seasons. I mean, the important thing to say about green witchcraft as well, moving away from, more sort of esoteric aspects of it, is that it is also responding to climate anxiety, which, as we all know, has intensified over the last 5-10 years. So a lot of green witches practice, adhere to sort of eco-feminist principles, environmental concerns, recycling, sustainability. It's kind of part of, it's a lifestyle.
So it's about being kind of more connected to nature in in a positive way.
Exactly, and understand that we are a part of nature, that we are not in control of nature, and we need to respect all living entities. We're just one of many.
You've been listening to the Research for Good podcast. To find out more about research in the School of Management, you can visit our website or click the links in the episode description.